Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin and welcome to another random review. And today the random review is Peter Jackson's World War I documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old. This is quite a technological achievement. Peter Jackson took World War I footage from the Imperial War Museum, and obviously silent films go at a certain speed. They're usually between 13, 16, 17 frames per second, and obviously modern films go at 24 frames per second, so they had to convert all the footage. They had about 100 odd hours of footage, and the film's about an hour and 40, but they had to stick it all in a computer and get it up to 24 frames a second, so the computer would add frames. Not exactly sure how it does that, but it added frames, so the film actually runs at a normal speed for modern audiences. So that's kind of the first thing that brings this footage that's 100 years old up to the modern day. And the next thing they did, they colorized it. So again, it kind of brings it into a modern audience. Because the one thing that you kind of take away from this film is the faces of the soldiers. They also had an ability to kind of zoom in on parts as well, so there's lots of shots of soldiers' faces. Chronologically, this film is pretty much from the start of the war to the end of the war. It just focuses on soldiers in the West Front, rather than trying to scattershot approach and have a little bit of everything about World War I. The only voices you hear are from the soldiers themselves, so there's no narration, it's just soldiers talking about their experiences, which again makes it more vital and more alive. So it kind of starts with the age for recruiting was officially 19, but you have all these guys that are like 15 and 16 years old, some at 14, pretty much changing their age so they could go. Because one of the narratives that kind of this film changes is, you know, the guys who went, a lot of them, you know, wanted to go. A lot of them thought it would be an adventure. A lot of them thought it would kind of kill the boredom of their day-to-day lives and mundane jobs that they had. There's voiceover at the start about how guys, you know, had no regrets about doing it, and if they had to do it again, they would do it. There is a nice interview with Mark Kermode with Peter Jackson special features at the BFI, and obviously Peter Jackson makes the point that that's all well and good, but the guys who died probably have a different view of the war and maybe wouldn't want to do it again, but obviously we can't interview them. So there was about 1 million British soldiers that died. But again, it starts with people lying about their age so they could go, and it's intercut with again, images of faces of really young boys, essentially, going off to fight in a world war. And again, it details the recruitment, it details the fact that, there's a guy that says he had one uniform for 4 years in the army. The uniforms generally didn't fit, and then they were whipped into shape in camps before they went, and then they were shipped off in boats. They didn't know where they were going, they were never told where they were going, and then they would just turn up. So, like I said, it's chronological. It's kind of the recruitment, and then the training, and then getting there, and then obviously the conditions, and it goes into, obviously the guys tell you all about the details of not very pleasant conditions, with lice and bathroom arrangements, and then obviously the fighting, and this is obviously all captured on film, because in those days it would be the huge big box cameras, so just about all the guys would have never seen a camera like that in their lives. So there's people who smile at the camera and laugh at the camera, and there's other people who just stare at it blankly, and again, it's the faces that stick with you. And again, Peter Jackson kind of said the whole reason for doing this and getting it into proper frames per second and colorizing it was so it was actually about the people involved, rather than doing a big grand overview of the First World War. It's a war that didn't really need to be fought. It's a war that just seems pretty pointless. Obviously World War II's always talked about as the war that had to be fought, whereas World War I just seems such a waste of human life. There's nice kind of moments with German prisoners, because they did, the kind of British and German armies did kind of see a kinship with each other, because they were both in the same living conditions, and you'd have German prisoners who were medics, and they would just help out with the British injured without being asked. They would just help out, and it was the same in the other way, and they kind of felt like at times they shouldn't even be fighting each other. They should be fighting the French and the Russians. So again, that kind of dynamic changes as well, as far as, yes, their job was to kill each other, but they kind of had the sense of, why are we really doing this? And nobody really knew the big picture about the war. It was pretty much, you have to go over the top. Obviously there's no combat footage of that, but Peter Jackson does a nice job of cutting in sound and showing cartoons that were made at the time that were published in papers. But you do see lots of dead bodies in the film. It doesn't shy away from the horror of war, but it also shows the humour that went on in the trenches, because when you're under that kind of pressure, you don't really have much choice but to have humour. Yeah, I mean, it's just such a well done film, you can argue one way or the other about colorizing it, but certainly having it running at the proper speed does make it more immediate and more palatable and more recognizable as a modern film. And then of course you get the moment where they find out that the war's over, and a lot of them are like generally confused. Most of them say there was no kind of celebration, it was more kind of just relief. And then, very much like Vietnam and other wars, they kind of went home and nobody was that bothered about it. Nobody wanted to talk about it. It was difficult for them to get jobs. Employers would have signs saying no ex-servicemen. So they just kind of felt a bit disconnected when they came back. But of course, those that survived that were young, you know, in 20 years or so there'd be World War II, and then they'd be back in that. Sadly, we never seem to learn. So I would highly recommend watching this film. It's one of those films that everybody could kind of watch to get a more human perspective on the First World War, because I think the First World War is kind of forgotten about for some reason. Granted, I don't know whether it has a lot of repeat viewing. Obviously it gives a list at the end of the guys that are speaking, and their regiment that they were in. So certainly it's very worthwhile for people who are trying to, you know, trace relatives that were in the war. And again, because of the way it's been restored and colorized, and like I say, they did zoom in on certain footage to get closer to the faces, so people might actually be recognised, and family members might actually recognise people, which is certainly a fantastic reason for doing the film. And like Peter Jackson says, out of the 100 hours, they restored all the 100 hours. So even though the film's only 100 minutes or 99 minutes, they did restore all the footage that the Imperial War Museum gave them. And he said he hopes that other archives do the same thing, because the technology there is now available to restore film from 100 years ago. So yeah, well worth checking out. Give you a bit of perspective. They Shall Not Grow Old. Arguably the best thing Peter Jackson's ever done. Yeah, check it out. I think this is actually sold very well, which is kind of an encouraging sign. I think it was one of the more successful purchases for Christmas, which is quite encouraging. So yes, check it out. Peter Jackson's They Shall Not Grow Old. So thank you for watching this random review. This is Solitary Ronin saying thank you very much, and we'll see you again.